Good evening. Traditionally, when a president visits a city in mourning, he meets with victims and families, doctors and nurses, police and other first responders. He praises their efforts, and most of all, he listens to those who've lost loved ones and adds what words of comfort he can. President Trump did that today in Dayton and El Paso, as is tradition, away from cameras, away from microphones. At least we have to assume that is exactly what he did. But we also, just moments ago, heard the President of the United States using some of his precious time to talk about himself and to attack an Ohio senator and the mayor of Dayton. Somehow, for some reason, the president felt this was an appropriate venue to air his grievances and praise himself. The president spoke tonight shortly before leaving El Paso, and where any other president might have put the victims first, or the wounded, or the first responders, this president's first words were about the love and respect he got in Ohio.
We had an amazing day. As you know, we left Ohio, and the love, the respect for the office of the presidency, I wish you could have been in there to see it. I wish you could have been in there.
He wishes you could have been in there to see all the love and respect he got, the office of the presidency. He did not mention the dead in either city. They're 31, 22 in El Paso, 9 in Dayton. He didn't mention the wounded. He briefly nodded toward a first responder and said he looked forward to working with Democrats on, quote, getting something done in Washington, but he did not go into specifics on that. Where he did get very specific was when asked about his attacks today on some of his hosts in Dayton. But before we get to that, to quickly set the stage for that, here's what happened. According to Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown, he was well received at the hospital there and, quote, did the right things. The president, he said, was comforting. Dayton's mayor, who we're going to talk to in a moment, adding, quote, I think the victims and the first responders were grateful that the President of the United States came to Dayton, which is precisely what you'd expect to be said of any president. Yet it wasn't praise enough for this president. So with the help of his social media director, he made it known. Dan Scavino tweeting, quote, some extremely powerful moments throughout the entire visit with so much enthusiasm and love, contrary to what the Trump-hating Dems would ever share or say. The president was treated like a rock star inside the hospital. The president was treated like a rock star inside the hospital. The president weighed in saying, quote, just left Dayton, Ohio, where I met with the victims and families, law enforcement, medical staff, and first responders. It was a warm and wonderful visit, tremendous enthusiasm and even love. Then I saw failed presidential candidate 0% Sherrod Brown and Mayor Whaley totally misrepresenting what took place inside of the hospital. Their news conference after I left for El Paso was a fraud. As I said, the mayor is going to join us in a moment. And again, she had nothing bad to say about the visit, but the president wanted rock star and I guess had to settle for normal, decent human being and apparently nursed that grudge all day. Here's what he said about a few minutes ago.
Well, they shouldn't be politicking. They shouldn't be politicking today. I had it with Sherrod Brown. He and the mayor, Nan Wally, they asked to go in. Could we possibly go in and make the tour with you? I said, yeah, let's do it. They couldn't believe what they saw, and they said it to people. They've never seen anything like it. The entire hospital, no different than what we had in El Paso. The entire hospital was, everybody was so proud of the job they did because they did a great job. They did a great job here. And then I say goodbye. I took them in at their request. We made the tour. They couldn't believe it. She said it to people. He said it to people. I get on Air Force One where they do have a lot of televisions. I turn on the television, and there they are saying, well, I don't know if it was appropriate for the president to be there, et cetera, the same old line. They're very dishonest people, and that's probably why he got, I think, about 0% that he failed as a presidential candidate.
That was the president in El Paso. The president today also attacked Joe Biden, who had just criticized him. He did that on the way to El Paso, tweeting, quote, watching sleepy Joe Biden making a speech, so boring. The lamestream media will die in the ratings and clicks with this guy. It will be over for them, not to mention the fact that our country will do poorly with him. So that's the president of the United States talking about cable news ratings and online clicks. That's what he was thinking about and openly tweeting about en route to a city where 22 people had been massacred in a racist attack. He said this just hours after claiming his words bring people together. There really are so many moments now when it's hard to know why we listen to anything the president says and take it at face value, because inevitably he undercuts what he has been told to say moments later sometimes, or hours later, by revealing time and time again what he is really thinking about. The day began with these words from the president.
No, I don't think my rhetoric has at all. I think my rhetoric is it brings people together.
Well, he's right about that today in a certain sense. Here, how far from normal this is, or sadly at this point, how typical. Joining us now is Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley, who, as we said, hosted the president earlier today. Mayor, first of all, I just want to start with what's actually important, how the city is doing, how people are dealing with this now, right today.
Well, thank you, Anderson. Folks in the city are grieving. This is going to be a long process for us, and it's quite emotional as we, and even we all are processing this at different rates. Folks are talking about the emotional trauma now that is coming forward. There's some survivor guilt. There's sadness for the loved ones we've lost. This is going to be a long process for us in Dayton.
Yeah, and of course, there is no timeline for grief, and everybody grieves in different ways. In terms of the injured, do you have any updates on their conditions?
Yeah, so we saw some of the folks that were still in the hospital today. There's only a few left in the hospital, but folks actually came back to see the president today, and they seem to be doing okay physically. It's really the emotional toll that's going to be the long, hard road here.
And for people, just in terms of, I was in El Paso, and there are a lot of people who needed help in terms of paying for funerals and things like that, and a lot of organizations coming forward. Are you seeing that in Dayton as well?
Yeah, there's been a lot of great support in Dayton. A lot of people just really holding on to one another and supporting each other in ways that, I'm not surprised by. This is a gritty, resilient city, but it's been really beautiful to see. Sunday night's vigil at 8 o'clock that we had, this whole area was filled all the way, basically the entire block. It was beautiful. There was a lot of compassion, a lot of grieving, but a lot of anger too.
I want to turn just briefly to the president and what he said today. I first want to play what you actually said about his visit to the hospital earlier. Let's listen.
I think the victims and the first responders were grateful that the President of the United States came to Dayton.
You also commented on his rhetoric, how it can be divisive and how divisive rhetoric is the last thing that Dayton needs. But did you say anything else about his visit to the hospital?
No, Anderson. That was pretty much all we talked about with the press. It's a full press conference, which I think the president saw. Our conversation and, what we really are, we're grateful for the president coming and comforting these victims. But what the city of Dayton and Daytonians want is some action out of Washington, D.C. And we didn't get a lot of comments about anything really being done from the president's desk.
So did you have conversations with the president or his staff, or did Senator Brown have conversations with the president or anyone on his staff about what you would like to see happen in terms of action? Absolutely. When he first came off onto the tarmac, I said to the president, welcome to Dayton. The citizens of Dayton are looking for action. And Senator Brown said it most eloquently. He said, the best gift you could give these first responders, Mr. President, is getting these guns off the street so they don't have to fight them anymore. Did he respond to that?
He said, we're going to do something.
So the president called you and Senator Brown, quote, very dishonest people. Do you know where that comes from? What you say to that?
Look, I think I've known and watched President Trump's Twitter feed for a while. He is a bully and a coward, and it's fine that he wants to bully me and Senator Brown. We're okay, we can take it. But the citizens of Dayton deserve action. And, we're just hoping that, this isn't just a typical politician that's all talk and no action. We want to see, and the citizens of Dayton want to see him do something around some common sense gun legislation.
Does it, I don't know, I was going to ask, does it surprise you? I assume it probably doesn't surprise you, but that a president, is it appropriate that any president of the United States would go to a city and take time in that city, again, not speaking about the victims, though he did meet with victims' families in both cities, but instead of, taking time to talk about them in public remarks, to take time to attack you and Senator Brown and talk about him getting 0% according to the president? I mean, does that make any sense to you that a president would do that?
No, I mean, I really don't understand the comments at all. And, he did have good rapport with the victims. We said that, and the first responders were grateful. Really keeping this the focus on the victims and then also on getting something done really was the whole crux of the whole conversation. We just want some action from the president, and it's something that the citizens of Dayton have demanded. We've seen that Governor DeWine, who is a Republican in this state, has introduced and has a 17-point plan that he'll start putting legislation forward. So we're seeing bipartisan support for this. Congressman Turner, who has a 93% vote NRA record, called for an assault weapons ban. So we're seeing movement in Ohio of being able to see this effort. We just was hoping that we could see some action from the president as well.
Mayor Willey, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anderson.
Coming up next, we're going to talk with our political professionals about the president's tone today and questions about his capacity for rising to the occasion. Coming up later, we'll hear from the U.S. Congresswoman who represents... We're talking tonight about President Trump's remarks just a few moments ago in El Paso, in which he put himself or his political grievances first and last. As you heard Dayton's mayor say before the break, there was nothing out of the ordinary about his visit with the wounded, even though he's now taking exception to the mayor's remarks and took pains to highlight the reception that he got.
We had an amazing day. As you know, we left Ohio, and the love, the respect for the office of the presidency, I wish you could have been in there to see it. I wish you could have been in there.
Well, again, in that speech praising himself, his only remarks to the press on the trip, he didn't mention the dead in either city, 31, 22 in El Paso, 9 in Dayton. He didn't mention the wounded. Joining us now is CNN senior political commentator, former Republican presidential candidate, and former U.S. Senator Rick Santorum, also CNN political commentator Tara Setmayer, former communications director for Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, and CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, to hear the president, I mean, what I don't understand is, by all accounts, in the hospitals, he did a nice job meeting with the victims' families and the wounded and first responders and doing what presidents do. And the president is a very charming guy when he wants to be, and I'm sure he was great with it. To undercut that by publicly have his statements be about, Sherrod Brown getting 0%.
The three words that always characterize the president's behavior are shocking but not surprising. I mean, this is how the narcissism, the lack of empathy, the endless sense of grievances, even invented grievances with Sherrod Brown and the mayor of Dayton, who had no fight with him there. I mean, this is who he is, and it is important to remember every time people try to change his behavior, when they bring in a new White House chief of staff, he says, I got elected president of the United States being exactly this way. And he's right, and he may get reelected as president behaving exactly this way.
Senator Santorum, we've all seen these, unfortunately, kind of presidential visits before. Was this the way to end it?
No, you know that the president watches the media. He was watching it on Air Force One, and the media is reporting all day about all the protesters who were out there and how angry everybody was and how everybody didn't want him to come and how elected officials, Democrats and others were complaining about it. So what he was hearing, what he was responding to, I think, is the fact that the media spin on this was nobody wanted the president to come, and he wanted to counter that narrative and say, well, as a matter of fact, people were very happy to see me. And so you can't take the president's comments in a vacuum. I mean, he's responding to what the media narrative is about his trip, and then you criticize him for responding to it.
But he's not a child, and he's the president of the United States, and he's just met with people who have lost loved ones, people who have had their body parts blown apart. He's not talking about them. He could have waited to Washington to go back and air his... He did talk to them. He didn't talk publicly at all about them. So we don't, I hope he talked to them, and I assume he did a great job, because as I said, he can be a very charming guy, but he's not a child who has to have a respond to everything right away in front of first responders and in a hospital setting. I mean, it just seems tawdry, no?
I would agree with you that I would not have done it that way,
Right.
but I think we all know the president well enough to know that when he feels like he's being attacked and his good intentions are being misrepresented, then he's going to try to counter that narrative. I agree. Right. It could have waited, but I would make the argument that the people who were out there, like even the mayor, lobbying for something that she well knows the president's never going to support, was also as inappropriate as what the president did.
It's inappropriate?
No.
Yeah, I do.
What's inappropriate about mentioning
This is a time when he's going to meet with victims and first responders, and she can't help herself, and Sherrod Brown can't help herself to say, you need to call McConnell, you need to do this, you need to do that, instead of trying to work on things that they can work on maybe together to try to help these victims?
Tarek, I want to hear from you.
Here's the bottom line. Today was not supposed to be about Donald Trump, but he's such a malignant narcissist that he cannot allow 1 minute of one day, even in the wake of 2 massacres in this country, to go by without it being about him. He's not the consoler in chief. He never will be. He's the victim in chief. Everything about him is about victimizing poor me. I mean, for goodness sakes, pull up your big boy pants and act like the President of the United States and rise to the occasion for once. I mean, come on. You can't sit here and tell me, Rick Santorum, that you looked at the way the President behaved today and you were proud of that. Is that what you want as the President of the United States? You're proud of that? Because that's an embarrassment. He acted like a 5-year-old because he couldn't take some criticism. He couldn't take the protesters. I mean, for goodness sakes, he couldn't even remember the name of Glendon Oakley, who was a hero in El Paso that saved children. But he was happy to stand there and take a photo op with the black guy who was a hero. I mean, he couldn't even bother to remember his name. But the first thing that came out of his mouth was, oh my goodness, everyone, it was such an amazing day today. Amazing? People died. People died in El Paso, partly because of the rhetoric that he's incited with white supremacists in this country. And he's talking about what an amazing day it was because he got a couple of hugs and slaps on the back in the hospital in Dayton. It's ridiculous. We are talking about the fight for the soul of America, as Joe Biden so eloquently discussed today. And this right here, what the president is doing, this cannot be what the American people deserve.
The reality is that the people who have been politicizing this moment has not been the President of the United States. It's been the Democratic candidates for president, as well as a lot of local elected officials.
They're not president. He is.
You know what?
Rick.
They are not president, but the president is a human being like everybody else, and he has a right to defend himself when he's being attacked, unlike any president during a time of crisis.
Today's not about him.
Every other president who has tried to be a uniter and a consoler was not met with this kind of hostility. They're just not. You can say, well, he's different.
You're kidding.
But that's just
Obama
simply
wasn't
not
met
the
with
case.
This? Obama wasn't met with this kind of hostility
No,
when people like
not
you
even
and other
close.
Republicans went after
Not
him,
even
saying
close.
that he incited police violence when all that was going on with Black Lives Matter. You guys didn't go after him, claiming that that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were responsible for ISIS and therefore the Paris attack. You said that yourself. So don't sit here and tell me that Republicans didn't go after Obama the same way.
But
they did, and I was one of them. But at least be intellectually honest about it.
I just like this business of politicizing. It strikes me that at a time when assault weapons are used to kill large numbers of American people is exactly the right time to talk about whether assault weapons should be legal. It's exactly the right time to talk about whether people should be able to buy guns without background checks. This idea that there's some politics-free moment after these events is just an excuse not to talk about what's really at stake here.
It is true that if a Muslim person or an undocumented immigrant had committed the horrific shooting in El Paso, do you really think the president would say, you know what, this is not the time to talk about banning all Muslims, or this is not the time to talk about undocumented immigrants and illegal aliens coming over here and infesting our communities? I mean, that would exactly be what the president would do, no?
Well, it's the difference between talking about the perpetrator of the crime and the instrument being used in the crime. And I think it is appropriate to talk about what we can do to stop perpetrators of crime from perpetrating those crimes. And it's not necessarily talk about, well, did they use a car? Did they use a knife? Did they use a gun? Did they use a handgun?
You don't think part of that conversation would be how did this Muslim terrorist get an AK-47 in the United States?
Well,
how did this illegal alien get a pump action shotgun or an AR-15? safety. That would, of course, be part of the conversation.
The reality is, Anderson, that we had an assault weapons ban in this country, and the institution, the Urban Institute, who was charged with looking as to whether it reduced crime, said we actually can't make a decision because it hasn't reduced crimes at all, because so few crimes are committed with these guns.
Well, no, what it said was we can't. No, actually, what they said was the final report on it is we cannot. There's been a drop in crime, but we can't link that to this ban because it's not really a ban, because there's so many assault weapons out there, and people who couldn't get assault weapons went and got other weapons with high-capacity magazines. That's what the final report said. Right. It said, had the ban lasted longer, maybe we could study long-term as these guns age and new guns aren't being brought in. But essentially it said they couldn't come to a determination. They couldn't make a linkage between the drop in crime. So you're right in the bottom line that it's not a guarantee. There's no one can argue 100% assault weapons ban would have any impact.
And that's the whole point. But we do know that there are things that we can do, and we can do in a bipartisan way. I mean, if people are really serious about trying to engage, as opposed to just playing politics, which is what's going on right now, and try to engage. You heard Will Hurd on the last show talk about a variety of different things that can be done in a bipartisan way to start dealing with the problems of internet violence and depression and disassociation of all these people who are committing these crimes. And if you see something, say something on the internet, and have law enforcement take these things seriously. There's lots of things that can be done if we really want to try to unify and get behind this, but that's not what people are talking about. That's not what the media is talking about.
That's not what the president's talking about.
Rick is talking about the agenda of the National Rifle Association, which owns the Republican Party in total. And so all that nonsense about violent video games is a way of not talking about the fact that the guy in Dayton had a gun that had 100 bullets in it at once. And that's legal because the National Rifle Association wants it to be legal. And that's who's in charge of gun policy in the United States.
Terry, you could also make the argument that, there's plenty of depression in Japan, and there's a lot of people who play very violent video games in Japan, and there's a lot of, mentally unstable people all around the world, and yet there are not the mass killings that we see in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you can make the correlation that it's because guns are so readily available here. I mean, I don't think that completely dismissing the desensitization of violence and immersing yourselves in these violent video games the way these millennials do, playing them 10 and 12 hours a day, isn't a factor. But I don't think that should be used to deflect away from some of the other things. And if the president was serious about actually pushing through bipartisan legislation, he would have. He made promises to Democrats after Las Vegas, after Parkland. Nothing happened.
Right, he was going to get strong in background checks.
Right, and instead of wasting time going after Beto O'Rourke on Twitter, or now he just recently tweeted tonight against Joaquin Castro and his brother, calling them nobodies, instead of wasting that kind of time when we're in national mourning looking for real solutions, maybe he should get to work and stop freaking watching cable news and tweeting all the time and actually do the job of the presidency.
We got to leave it there. Appreciate the discussion, Rick Santorum, always. Harrisette Mayor Jeff Toobin as well. Just ahead, my interview with Democratic Congresswoman who represents the area where the El Paso mass shooting occurred, why she declined to join President Trump's motorcade today. We'll be right back. As we mentioned, the president has just left El Paso. I spoke earlier this evening with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, whose district includes the Walmart where Saturday's shooting took place, and who turned down, she says, a White House invitation to join the president's motorcade, saying yesterday, and I quote, "I declined the invitation because I refused to be an accessory to his visit." CNN reporting about a sustained and failed attempt to get this White House to focus more on domestic terror and white supremacy. Two Democratic presidential candidates already reacting. CNN's Jake Tapper is new reporting that the Department of Homeland Security tried for more than a year to no avail to make combating domestic terror a greater priority for this administration. The best they could do was one paragraph in the National Counterterrorism Strategy. It's what a senior source involved in the discussions tells Tapper was, quote, a throwaway line. Two presidential candidates have reacted so far to the story. Senator Kamala Harris says the president is, quote, turning a blind eye to America's national security threats. And Beto O'Rourke says, quote, he made us less safe. Also today, the president appears to be taking a page from his Charlottesville playbook, no longer talking solely about taking on white supremacy, as he did from the White House Monday. Today, before he left for Dayton, he spoke about the violence on essentially both sides.
I am concerned about the rise of any group of hate. I don't like it. Any group of hate. I am, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's any other kind of supremacy, whether it's Antifa, whether it's any group of hate, I am very concerned about it, and I'll do something about it.
Well, joining me now is CNN national security analyst and a former assistant secretary at DHS, Juliette Kayyem. So, first of all, what do you make of Jake Tapper's reporting that the administration essentially has resisted in the past focusing on this?
Well, I think it's essential for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's inconsistent with what the FBI has told us, right, that the rise of white supremacy is the number one terrorism threat in the United States. It's not ISIS. It's not immigrants. So there's just a misalignment between what the Department of Homeland Security was focusing on and certainly what the FBI was seeing. But what's as important and what people have to understand is that the Department of Homeland Security essentially guides state and local efforts. There's only about 12,000 FBI agents. There's over 800,000 local, state, and county police officers who need guidance, right, from a department that should be able to look at the statistics and tell them what they should focus on. So the White House essentially, by seeing no evil, right, would stop no evil. So it just undermined everything that was going on the ground until today, or over the last couple of days, we wake up and realize this is a real threat that's killing lots of people.
So it isn't just semantics. I mean, when something isn't prioritized federally, it impacts, you're saying, state and local law enforcement, which is really where the rubber hits the road.
That's exactly right. I mean, we used to say at the Department of Homeland Security, just overall, there's only 300,000 of us, right? There's only about 300,000 Department of Homeland Security employees and millions of first responders across the United States. So what we did from the department, or what a good department would do, is it would guide priorities, it would guide funding. The Department of Homeland Security writes big checks to state and local first responders, but has guidance about how they should focus it. So the fact that they could barely mention white supremacy, meanwhile, the FBI is, hair on fire saying this is a big issue, means that I'm not surprised that state and locals are caught off guard because with the rise of white supremacy.
It's interesting when the president, talks about white supremacy. I mean, initially he said, hate and bigotry, racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. I assume now he's put Antifa in there. I assume that's in the hate, bigotry part. I'm not sure of those three, but I mean, it was just back in March that the president was asked if he saw white nationalism as a rising threat. He said no. As you mentioned, that is counter to what his own FBI director says. And now he's sort of just, he's never really willing to just kind of drill down and even talk extensively about white supremacy or white nationalism. It's just sort of, I'm against hate and all supremacies.
Right. So I want people to understand that this is purposeful, that this is what I've been talking about, what we've been talking about. This is part of the playbook. We call it stochastic terrorism. In other words, it's a use of social media, use of the president's platform to essentially radicalize, to incite hatred towards the other, Mexicans, Hispanics, immigrants, LGBTQ, African Americans, whoever, that will more likely than not result in violence, even though if we don't know specifically what that violent action will be. So this is something that those of us who know about radicalization have been talking about for a while. This is what the president is doing. It's not an accident. It's not like he cares about all of these different kinds of ideologies. It's a way for him not to shame white supremacists. Now, the political people can decide why he's doing that. But essentially what it does is it gives comfort. It gives a sense of acceptance to the community of white supremacists who are inspired by this kind of language. So I don't give the president a binary. He's the president of the United States. He's not an innocent bystander. He's not just, throwing words out there. This is a strategy that the president is utilizing that we've seen in other terrorism and other radicalization efforts. And the fact that he turned back to it today, to me, is no surprise.
So, I mean, at some point, can law enforcement officials, whether it's DHS or FBI Director Chris Wray or U.S. attorneys around the country, just say, look, fighting white nationalism, might not be a priority for President Trump, but it is a priority for us, and they'll do whatever they feel they need to do? Is that how? Does it work that way?
I think that's true to a certain extent. Obviously, the FBI, obviously local, state, and county first responders do not want bad things happening. And so I do believe that there is a focus on this, especially after the horrors of the last couple of days. But I think it defies logic to think that the president's priorities, right, won't have an impact on people's willingness to start these investigations, the community's willingness to come forward, people's interest in the issue. A White House matters. I've always worked at departments, either the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security. So just from a bureaucratic perspective, White Houses matter because they get the departments to focus. And that's essential. And so with the White House unwilling to mention, barely mention white supremacy means that, yes, people are looking at this, but you need the White House to embrace it, to really, really fight it.
Julia Keim, appreciate it. Thank you. Breaking news just ahead.
Thank you.
Lawyers for the... It's almost time for our CNN Town Hall. America under assault, the gun crisis, moderated by my friend Chris Cuomo. Chris joins us right now. What are you going to be focusing on, Chris?
Brother, the time is now. You and I have been to too many of these together. The issues never change. We just wind up staring into different faces who have the same pain. And many will tell us, well, let it pass, let them process, don't politicize. It's not about politics, it's about change. And it's about talking about what we know is obvious through the filter of people who've lived it, who work on the issues, and who understand the obstacles. It's not about right and left, it's about reasonable, and it's about change. And all of us tonight being open to a conversation we know we need to have.
And so that's who you're talking to tonight.
We have different sets of panels. We have people who have survived. We have an audience full of survivors. I wanted them around me because I want to be surrounded by their strength. And them putting pain to purpose is one of the most beautiful gifts of humanity. And we'll have panels of people who've lived through it, people who deal with the issues on different sides. This is not about how do we get rid of guns. I don't think that's a political practicality.